So today we've got a great panel, so I'll just briefly introduce them and then let them speak for themselves. So we have Matthew Gamble, principal at IT13 Consulting, Shelley Robinson, the executive director of National Capital FreeNet, Asennaienton, director of Workforce Development, Indigenous Connectivity Institute, sorry, one over, and Michel Mersereau, an assistant professor from U of T. And so today we're going to be talking about how to advance digital equity, how can communities exercise their own agency to improve the state of connectivity, what can the private sector do, what policy changes may need to happen. But to get us started, I'm just going to ask each panel to list in 1 minute or less. A small question, how would you describe the state of Canadian connectivity today? And Matt, I'm going to start with you first.
I would say in 1 minute or less that we've made great strides, but we still have a lot of work to do. That's the last mile that we haven't finished yet. I know the last mile is always a broadband term, but really those last people we haven't gotten to yet are going to be the hardest, and that's all the work that's ahead of us.
Michelle, I'm going to go to you next.
Oh, thanks. Definitely progress has been made. So credit where credit is due. I see a lot of really positive momentum and groundswell movement in the local and community broadband network sector, municipal broadband networks, whether they're operated at the local or municipal or the First Nations level, or even entirely owned by the municipality. So I think that's something exciting to see as a viable alternative to the incumbent service market. I would also say that there are significant knowledge gaps that, to my mind, in my area of scholarship and my focus on the policy side, there are significant knowledge and knowing gaps in the regulatory arena, both in terms of what our regulators know about the state of connectivity on the ground, about at the industry level, what in turn is pushed out to the public. And importantly, the questions that we're asking, practical questions around affordability, practical questions around access, what does it mean, and how we, asking the right questions, hopefully will lead us down a path where we are actually implementing more meaningful measurement mechanisms.
Thank you. Asennaienton.
You can call me Frank, but thank you for the try. In terms of I would say we have done a lot of work, yes, but from the Indigenous perspective, we're kind of the forgotten, and a lot of discussion that we've had today, there's kind of like a have and have not perspective, and from the Indigenous Connectivity Institute's perspective, we're grassroots representing Indigenous voices, and what we hear over and over again is we're on the wrong side of the fence. How can we get on the right side of the fence? So there's still a lot of work to do.
Thank you. And Shelley.
Frankly, I'm glad you had some critiques because I sound like a super drag. So I wrote down a bunch of words. So compromised, top down, static, and protectionist. I always struggle, oligopolistic, financialized to the point of abstraction. And all the most interesting work is happening at the margins. So if you think about it as like a sidewalk, I think the most interesting stuff is happening in the cracks of the sidewalk. And so it's great that the grass is growing, but we're going to need, a lot of time and support for that to widen. And by and large, we're looking at gray concrete that overtakes everything.
Okay, thank you. Lots to chew on just from the 1 minute responses. So to continue the discussion, I'm going to turn over to Michelle to pick up some of what you said. We've made a lot of progress. There have been lots of investments made, but there's still some gaps, especially in our understanding of what the infrastructure looks like. And so I just thought you could enlighten us or tell us about, how some of the infrastructure investments have fared over the past several years, and what else is needed, and particularly the information and measurement side, to ensure that all Canadians have access to reliable, quality broadband.
Thank you. So I'll do my best here. So there have been lots of investments. I'm not sure I would qualify that as success. And one of the reasons I wouldn't necessarily qualify that as success is partly as a result of um, what we are actually assessing. So I'll give a very concrete example. Ontario, the sort of the pandemic initiative for the Ministry of Infrastructure, really significant, $4+ billion, I believe. And it was a phased reverse auction approach. And I was heavily involved on the governmental side at the outset of that in the first phase of reverse auction tenders that went out. And the point I'm trying to make here is that when we actually, with our colleagues at YorkNet, which is Laura Bradley, wonderful municipal broadband entity out there, and we really started to dig into the contracts as they were being announced, the awards that were being announced, who was actually getting funded, more specifically, what projects were getting funded and where. And when we started to look at that level, and we really looked at it from the view, there's a concept we use in municipal governance, in particular, I know higher levels they use as well, as best value for the public dollar. It doesn't necessarily mean the least expensive, but best value for the public dollar, because these are public dollars. So what we found was something troubling in terms of the number, the volume of awarded contracts that were going to already service areas. And when you got on the ground and you looked at the infrastructure, the infrastructural, the capital works level, what's going on? Why are monies through this through the Ontario government's broadband fund going to areas that are already nominally anyways serviced areas? And so when you get down to that capital works data level, and you see, well, service provider, incumbent service provider A or B, really was awarded this project because they wanted to extend a leg of their network that they finished 12 years ago, that additional 4 or 5 kilometers into the new residential development that didn't exist back then. So we started to see patterns like that. And really, to us, what that symbolized or signified to us was, all good intent on the part of the provincial government at the time, but not having the industry acumen or knowing to ask the right questions. Where should the money be going? So in our case, in that case, that's an example to me of not asking the right questions, not implementing the correct measurement mechanisms. And I'll say overall, as a raw quantitative assessment, just at the Ontario level, as of early 2024, I want to say February, March 2024, of all of that 4 billion and all the projects that were actually successfully funded, if you look at the actual completion rates, I mean, the province and funding entities love to lead with numbers of funded projects. We funded 133, 240 projects. That's what they like to lead with. But let's take a page um, from the housing policy playbook. How many projects actually get completed? And when you look at that metric, things become a bit more problematic. We know in the far north, less than 9% of those issued projects have actually been completed. Outside of the far north, it's just shy of 40% of those funded projects have actually been completed. So again, I'm going to bring it back to asking the right questions. What are we intending to measure, and are we getting best value for the public dollar?
Thank you. And Frank, Shelley, and Matt, I can see you all nodding along, so I invite you to weigh in.
When it comes to reverse auction, at the time I was at Rogers, and I was at.
You forgive me.
I know. I feel better now that I work for ICI, but I had an inside view. I won't share too much, but what I will share is there were desired locations that Rogers wanted, and there were other ones that was kind of like a cost benefit analysis. And they said, well, we're going to go here, and then if it goes beyond that point, we're walking away. And when it came to all the geographic zones, what was untouched and nobody would touch was the far north. And I know Rogers was approached by the provincial government saying, are you interested in taking the over $1 billion that's left on the table? And we looked at it and we walked away. We, as my Rogers hat. So, and when it comes to government subsidy, whether it's federal or provincial. From the Indigenous lens, they weren't really part of the process. Basically, when it came to geographic zones, if a First Nation just happened to be in there, we would knock on their door and say, "Congratulations, we want subsidy to build it. Are you interested?" And we didn't really understand. Like Rogers didn't understand the hesitancy and I guess, the initial tension in the conversation because they were never part of the conversation. And now you just think because you want it, you're going to get all the benefits of it and come into our territory, and you get it basically built for free, and then you have us as customers. Like it's all win-win-win for you. What are we going to get out of it? And that was kind of a wake-up call, I guess, to Indigenous communities when it comes to broadband infrastructure, saying, "Wait a minute here, what? There's got to be a better approach to this."
Yeah, I was going to say, I think really what this is showing us is the better approach is focusing more on municipal broadband, right? Where we're giving the money to these private companies who are building solely for their own use, what's good for them, what's in their interest, rather than focusing on municipal networks owned by the community with open access, where other ISPs can come in and commit at the service, they compete at the service level, not at the network level. I mean, we trust municipalities to build roads, electricity, but we don't trust them yet to build broadband in a lot of places there. And there are some success stories, but for the most part, municipal networks are almost non-existent in most of Canada. And if we put more of our money into that, I think we'd have a lot more bang for a buck in the end.
Yeah, I'm just going to chip in. So, National Capital FreeNet is a not-for-profit internet service provider, and we have a project where we're building, funded by Sierra, where we're building a Wi-Fi network for free Wi-Fi here in town, leveraging a municipal backhaul provider that's owned by Hydro Ottawa, and then leveraging the height of an Ottawa community housing tower. So for me, yes, municipal broadband, huge fan, but also a kind of partnership where a not-for-profit can do that work with a municipality. But that community ownership, I think, is so powerful. There's a market failure. So again, to Frank's point, like Rogers was like we expect Rogers to make business-based decisions. So they did. So then we have to say, okay, let's stop trying to sweeten the pot when it goes against their interests. Let's invest in the people who care about it, which are the people who are from that community and live in that community.
So I'll turn it back to you, Shelley, actually. Can you illuminate us with some examples of why a community-led initiative can be so successful and impactful? What are some of the challenges to getting those off the ground? And what can we think about moving forwards if we're in a position to fund them or to champion them?
Okay, so there are a bunch of really growing community networks, a lot from Indigenous nations and communities. So EU Communications, KNet, Clear Sky, Broadband Communications North. There's North End Connect, which is a not-for-profit doing it. Actually, it's the Internet Society Manitoba chapter, doing it in downtown Winnipeg. I also like that it gets around this thing that we've talked about urban versus rural. It's just saying there are folks who aren't able to connect. And sometimes that's an infrastructure problem because they're in a rural or remote or frankly just ignored community. And then other times it's because it's affordability challenges or those kinds of things in an urban center. And affordability cuts both ways. And City of Saskatoon has a project. So there are these things. There are also struggles, like you referenced. So there was Mamawapawin Technology Society, which was doing a Wi-Fi project, and the founder was featured on Al Jazeera. It was an amazing story. He was serving Musqueam, an Indigenous community, and nearby. He wanted to expand, and it's now gone under. And part of that is the challenge of there's no regulatory framework to acknowledge these kinds of operations. There's no ongoing funding to support them. So we all want to champion the start of a great community initiative without realizing that the investment has to take into account that they're smaller, that they don't have historical advantages of the incumbents, that they don't have the capacity. And so that's going to take a different kind of structure to make them work. 307net they got just over $4 million, and they're serving Chelsea, Cantley, thank you. I was looking at my colleague Andrew. So they're serving Cantley, and they lay their own fiber, and it's a huge success story. Except, and I don't want to tell their business out of school, but they're really struggling, and that's because they got funding to put in fiber, and then through a competing funding program, Bell got funding to come in, and then they went faster. They wiped out their customer base. So people who had been crying for internet for so long, they get a community-owned provider. The moment it's a going concern, the incumbents are going to come in and take it over, and then they can sell at a price that you can't meet as a small provider, because so you're committed to affordability, but you have economies of scale challenges. So many successes, and I think that's, for me, that grass through the sidewalk cracks. But we have to understand that nobody's watering the grass that's coming up through the sidewalk cracks, right? We're not tending those things. They're struggling to push themselves up. And so we need to widen the cracks, give some water, put some soil down, give the growing conditions if we want that to become a bigger sector.
And so to turn those growing conditions maybe into some practical policy solutions, do any of you have any thoughts on what those could be moving forward? Any policy changes that need to happen to facilitate that?
Well, I think one of the easiest ones we can start with is any publicly funded project needs to have an open access requirement. And today we don't put that in as a mandatory thing that you have to make your network open. But I think if public dollars funded your fiber, that fiber needs to be open to anybody to compete on. That'd be the simplest one to start with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wealth of literature on the market analysis side, mostly coming from the U.S. Wholesale Network Operators Associations down in the States, and they show very concrete terms right down to investment capital risk analyses that wholesale open networks are the path forward to universalizing fiber connectivity across the continent of the United States. And I don't see any reason why the same market logic cannot hold true here. So in principle, absolutely. The literature, the data is out there. The market agrees. I would say that the issue is less from a regulatory perspective in that, look, at the end of the day, there is a class of carrier on the books, non-dominant status carriers in Canada. It's not a particularly onerous or cumbersome undertaking to, as a corporate or even a public entity, a municipality like Calgary can register as a non-dominant carrier. So that's not particularly complex or problematic. The capital funding for it is a huge issue, even in large municipalities. I'm coming from the city, many years in telco in the city of Toronto. I could speak in very limited fashion to that here, but the challenges are administrative. Okay. You have even in a scenario where a municipality is otherwise in a relatively good position from a capital, not just a funding perspective, but also a capital works perspective. Municipalities are digging up streets all the time. It makes sense to drop conduit when you're tearing up the street. But the sensibility of it in real life terms drops off at that point, because when you actually try to coordinate those activities and try to get buy-in from administrative leadership, and then you run into the issue of local entities, municipalities or otherwise, being lobbied into the ground by incumbent carriers who see this as an existential threat. Okay, I agree 100%. Unfortunately, and this goes back to 2001, this is the market skeptic in me coming out, but going back to 2001, the Ledcor decision coming out of the CRTC, I know Brad, you weren't there at that point, but that really drove the nail in the coffin of the idea of open access fiber networks as a mandate or a regulated thing in Canadian telecommunications sector. And unfortunately, I don't think, even with the most recent wholesale decision, which I applaud that decision, but many industry analysts, especially wholesale network operators, might argue it's 10 years too late at this point. The market has been largely decimated in this country. So yeah, in principle, I think it's fantastic if you can convince a municipality to get past the risk of lobbying into the ground by not just incumbents coming out of left field, but incumbents who are also their enterprise service providers. I mean, look, listen, like, if you find a municipality that has the ideals, even in the elected domain, to, hey, this would be great, let's put open access infrastructure in the ground. That's fantastic. But then when you get into the dirt of it, and who is their vendor of record on the IT side, they're going to have something to say about that. And they're going to squeeze you in your contract negotiation. So this is the reality of what happens on the ground with public entities that try to do this. So I would put more eggs in the basket of non-affiliated, NGO, community-owned entities like that who don't come strapped with all of that baggage. That was a mouthful, but yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to switch the channel to affordability in a second, but I just wanted to see, Frank, if you wanted to contribute to this.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said. From a Indigenous community perspective, in the last round of the UBF, there were some Indigenous organizations that were successful, but not enough, in my opinion. And to me, that's just emblematic of the situation and the problem. And in terms of recommendations, I see it that see it like when I used to work in other sectors, and unfortunately, what has to happen is there has to be an Indigenous carve out in order to kind of, because if they compete on the same level, it's not it isn't a level playing field, and because it's not level, they don't really have it's it's stacked against them to be successful in the competitive process. So I think there has to be an Indigenous carve out, and where it's considerate of their perspective, and that they have a lot, because the traditional method of it is the incumbents they come in and say we have a solution for you, and it's kind of like I hate to use it, but it's like a white savior approach. We have solutions for you, and come and we have all the bargaining power in this negotiation. And when it comes to Indigenous, they're starting to get to the point where that approach is not enough anymore, and they need to have a, a pathway to kind of be able to kind of get to the point where they're okay, but they don't have to necessarily deal with all the other baggage that they all traditionally have to deal with, because it creates too many hurdles for them to get where they need to. Because ultimately, what we want is communities to be able to be at the same level playing field, and that would be my recommendation in terms of rethinking this process.
Can I sneak in one wonky-ish thing? Okay, so my background is in community radio. So on the broadcasting side, we have an understanding in Canada that we want a strong public broadcasting sector, that we want a community broadcasting sector, and then we want a strong private broadcasting sector. So traditionally, as you would expect, the community sector is smaller, it's less well-funded. That said, it's made huge leaps and bounds lately, and that's because there's an acknowledgement that it's an important part of the system, and therefore there have been things that have been built up to support that. So if there's three legs of a stool and then one leg is way shorter, you understand when you're tilting over that you need to build up the other stool. So on a telecom side, we could do the same thing. So there could be an Indigenous carve out, there could be a municipal / not-for-profit carve out, and then there's still the main system for big commercial players, be they incumbent or not, which then is this understanding that a strong system isn't municipal and nothing else. It's that we need this blend of things so that we can, build a plurality. There you go.
This is great. So I'm going to not away from, they're all related, but moving from the infrastructure access and build out sort of specific facet of this conversation, how can we improve affordability? So that's another aspect of the digital divide that's not news to anybody in this room. But as we heard earlier, cost per bit is going down, but we're using more data. We all pay for plans here. It's getting more expensive, like everything else in life. And so what are some changes that need to happen or solutions to try to make internet services more affordable? And I'm going to start with you, Matt.
Well, I think one of the biggest issues, and I know the CRTC did open up fiber access, but if you look at the pricing they put out for it, the price that they're charging wholesalers is actually close to what they charge retail to their flanker brands. And of course, the flanker brands say it's a 2-year promo, and so it's not really the retail price. Right? After 2 years, it goes back up to the full rate. But that's something really the Competition Bureau needs to be looking at, right? Because you can't have a viable wholesale market when the wholesale price is close to what somebody else is going to sell it for retail. And as long as we have that problem, we already saw almost every independent ISP in this country of large size be bought up in the last 5 years. There's only one or two major independent players left and then a handful of smaller ones. We can't really have a market of affordability when there's nobody left to compete. And now that they're all gone, we need to re-strengthen our wholesale market and encourage somebody to come back in and actually play in that market. Or we need to go and invest in community networks that can do it cheaper and faster. We need one of those two things to happen in order for affordability to come through.
Thank you. Okay, I see Shelley nodding her head.
We need both of those to happen. So NCF is a wholesale-based competitor. So we do sell internet access on the Bell and Rogers network, and with the fiber to the home, fiber to the prem decision, the tariff rate is higher than what Bell is charging for promo rates. So I can't possibly, never mind all the stuff I talked about with economies of scale and we're smaller and blah blah blah. It's there's so many costs beyond that first price that we can't possibly compete. So that's one. And so the reason, and I'm very excited we're building a community network, but the reason we were doing it is because if our mission is to be, affordable and high quality, we couldn't deliver it in the current wholesale structure. So that's a terrible failure. And so we need lower wholesale prices. We're never going to get them low enough for the people who are very low income. So I would suggest we also need a kind of portable, there's portable housing subsidies. So a portable subsidy for those who are low income so that you can choose your provider and you get to bring that subsidy with you. It's a program that exists in the States and works very well. So a low income subsidy, lower wholesale rates, and then creating a culture of supporting community networks.
Thank you. I'm going to continue down the line. Michelle.
Great comments. I think, and to the earlier point that was made when I was talking about the wholesale network operators in the US, and they've done really compelling analysis, this was all contingent on the correct policy levers being in place. So if the wholesale tariff framework is not going to be compelling, then the whole collapse. So that's a really great observation. I would say, you talked about affordability with subsidy. I think that's a fantastic idea. Where that leads me to question is, okay, in practical terms, what does that actually mean? So back to my opening statement, what are we measuring? What types of questions are we asking? What is practical affordability? We talk about a subsidy. Oh, we've delivered 300 million in subsidies to this particular cohort. That's fantastic. How meaningful is it in the lives of those households? And what I would suggest in terms of very actionable policy undertaking that the Commission could take in very short order is even through a round of consultations. Let's look at reframing what do we mean by affordability? The Competition Bureau has they've done a couple of iterations of comparative market analyses or cross-jurisdictional market analyses of retail service costs in different baskets. Okay. But again, that doesn't answer the question of practical affordability. Why aren't we looking at something like we do with other essential service areas, percentage of household income? Because I know from the really granular level data that we collect in the City of Toronto, both academically and on the municipal government side, we know that in struggling households, like sub $30,000 per year households, monthly expenses combined, mobile and fixed, which are equally important. If we're talking about true digital democratization, it can't be choosing one modality over the other. So if you look at those combined costs in low-income households, it's pushing 9, 10, 11%, which broadly mirrors what the Competition Bureau found a couple of years ago. Whereas in higher income households, you're at the sub 1% level. Why are we not trying to think about whether we should frame an affordability target in those terms? What percentage of household income? That would at least give us something to say subsidy, whether direct to consumer or whether funded broadband project. We are meeting those targets. This percentage of household income is serviced with these service packages across the board, but we're not doing it now. And that's something from the policy side that I believe the Commission could undertake in very quick action. I have one other recommendation. I won't make it at this moment. I'll make it at the end, but I'll pass it on.
When it comes to affordability for Indigenous communities, it is probably the big concern in most households because the economies are pretty tragic, and a lot of people are on social supports in order to live, and they have to make choices. And the choices that were shared before is that's prevalent in many Indigenous communities, and many communities have a phone, but they can't afford the. What I've heard from stories in the far north is in order for them to, they may have a phone, but they can't afford a plan for data. So what they have to do is use the public Wi-Fi, and everybody uses what they have in buildings, and that's just to have access. But that's that's one unfortunate solution that they have to do themselves, which is really not a solution. And it's a chicken and egg conversation in Indigenous communities. In order for them to be able to afford higher, what they should have is access to connectivity in order for them to give the opportunity to be able to drive their own economic futures better individually and as a community, and therefore then they may be in a better position to be able to afford it. Because I'm I realize that I own my own business. I'm in the infrastructure business with housing, with transit, and in broadband. And I see broadband and connectivity as an infrastructure conversation. And a community can't really move forward unless these things are dealt with. And if you have basic infrastructure in place, then you can build a community that can be more successful. And once the community is more successful, then we're having similar conversations in the urban setting than you have on reserve. So affordability, like you might hear about it, but until you go into a community and see it for yourself, it's heartbreaking. And I don't know if anybody hears those stories enough to be able to say, okay, I'm going to do something about it. It's easy to talk about it when you're down here in the urban setting, but when you go up there, you come back and it stays with you, and you hear the stories. And it's not just broadband; it's across the board. You hear the stories of water and electricity, and a lot of communities are struggling to they're still running diesel, and so it's from an indigenous perspective, it's all encompassing. And one little aspect of it is what we talk about broadband, and communities live it day to day. And I feel when you talk to the leadership of chief of council on reserve, they are inundated with the day to day, and for them to think forward to forward think on the larger scale, it's hard. That's why you need larger bodies like the PTO, like Treaty 3, or like the large organizations. They have to advocate for them because they speak on behalf. Because when it comes to the day to day, it is you're dealing with crises all the time.
Thank you for sharing. I think that is an important message for everybody in this room to hear, and I hope that we all take it home with us and into our respective day jobs, where we all have, I think, some form of an influence on what's going on. Not to shift away from this, but we're all at different parts of the conversation of uh, digital equity, and the people who are coming online for the first time, whether they're have been online for 2 weeks or 2 months or 20 years. We're all at different parts in our online safety and cybersecurity journey. And that's a critical part of meaningful connectivity, because it's one thing to be online, have access, and it's another thing to accidentally have all of your personal information stolen because you don't know what to do with it when you come online for the first time. Or for those of us who've been online for 20 years, sometimes you still don't know what to do with it. And so uh, I have a couple of questions. The first one is quickly, is there room for cybersecurity or digital literacy conditions on new builds or funded projects? And I think this is just a yes or no question. Um, Quickly down the line, I'm going to start with you, Frank. Yes or no?
Well, I would say yes. Security of information is it's a it's a community conversation that's been it's made more public. What community's tired of is their information being extracted for purposes that are beyond their control, and they share it, and then basically it's gone, and they don't necessarily they lost control of the narrative of that information that's sacred to them. And so what's important to them is what's a solution for them so that their information stays their own and they have control over it. And if there's an entity that comes to approach them, there's an agreement in terms of what information we can share and what you can do with it. And communities are on that path to take more control of it. They have a long way to go. That's a new conversation.
Thank you. Michelle.
I'll give a quick answer. I'm going to say no, and I'm going to say no because, and the previous panel did it. There were so many great thoughts that we could not, I personally could not trump with what was discussed. But I would suggest that treating digital literacy solely or exclusively as a form as an issue of formal pedagogy is a problem. Based on not only my own reading of the literature, but based on my own research, like I've undertaken in public housing, um, and the Native men's residence in Toronto, it's not something that's going to be resolved through formal pedagogy alone. It's a socially grounded solution. So I don't really think mixing it into a funded infrastructure plan is going to be particularly helpful.
Okay. Shelley.
I wrote earlier, maybe. So I don't want Bell or Rogers or Telus, whoever, I'm not trying to pick on just those two, to try and be teaching people digital skills. I think that that's a misapplication of the things that they're good at. But I do think that digital skills are crucial. So with our community Wi-Fi project, some of the things that we're bringing to underscore this is we're doing workshops at all the locations that we connect so that people can understand how to use the network and then also sort of understand the risks of it, understand the security, decisions we've made to help protect them. And we also have a help desk that folks can call. And it's not just a kind of like, do you have connectivity? It's like, how do you get connected? How do I change my Facebook password? These are the questions we already get. And so expanding that to folks who are using the Wi-Fi. So I think it's really crucial when we talk about, availability doesn't equal adoption, which came up earlier, then we need to help people adopt it. And that means that support for digital skills. So I think it should be baked in around infrastructure, but I think we would want to be really careful about maybe who delivers it and how it's delivered.
Yeah, as well as the second part of your question is actually cybersecurity. To me, the cybersecurity part needs to be baked in. The providers should be mandated to provide some base level, something like Cirrus Canadian Shield or some other competing product, that at least gets a minor level of cyber protection. Obviously, not all the way, not full shields up, but something at least make your internet experience a lot safer than not having anything at all. And that should be a mandatory offering for anybody to.
Okay, thank you. So we're almost out of time, so I have one last question for you each. So if you were able to leave policymakers, there's many that touch these files, with one recommendation that they have to implement tomorrow to improve connectivity or the online experience, you could wave your magic wand, what would it be? And I'm going to start with Shelley first.
Oh, that's good, because I feel like I would have been underscoring what folks said. So maybe now people will agree with me. We'll see. So if I had to pick one, because I had like 7 written down. So the one I'm going to pick is policymakers, I think, should invest or make space and provisions for community owned and operated internet providers, internet connectivity options.
Thank you. Michelle.
Yeah, so I already made one in terms of reframing affordability. The other one I think which would be really critical and very helpful for the commission and would even not even be a public facing policy decision. It would be an administrative policy action that they could easily and immediately undertake, and that would be to request Capital Works GIS files from all regulated carriers, at the very least incumbent carriers. This data exists. If the CRTC's response to my access to information request is to be believed, the CRTC currently does not request that information, but it does exist in the RGIS systems of Municipal Capital Works Department. And the reason why I'm suggesting a very simple administrative request would do so much to resolve. We have lots of these questions. Where's the money going? How effective? Whose projects are getting funded? At the street level. When I say street level, I'm not talking parcel definitely not talking FSA polyglot level that I said use this. I'm talking about linear meter, being able to know on Bank Street how many incumbent service providers have what diameter conduit on what side of the street going from what intersection to what intersection. I know that data exists. I have access to a significant portion of it. The CRTC can get access to that data, and I think that would help to resolve so many of these questions that we have been discussing, and I've heard other panels discuss all day, because it would just pull the curtain back on, okay, what is the state of affairs out there? What's in the ground? Who owns it? From where to where? And we can start to then intuit and engage in some informed speculation on the actual market rationalizations and the motivations behind what the major players are doing.
Thank you, Frank.
So I'm with the ICI, which is Indigenous Connectivity Institute, and it's a grassroots organization that's 3 years into, and it was formed in response to a wealth of conversation that has happened. And to me, the fact that conversations are happening and a solution, and a small group of us are trying to figure out a solution, what we're trying to do is repeat what we hear from community. And what we say, what I'm trying to parrot is they want to be part of the solution. And it was kind of mentioned today, when it comes to the indigenous population, we're the youngest, fastest growing. To me, that's an opportunity to be part of the solution. There's a lot of young people, and to invest in them, to give them opportunity and invest in their skills so that they can be part of the solution. Because we don't necessarily have to rely on immigration as the only solution. We can have it here in Canada, and we would be better as a country if we include our Indigenous population as part of the solution. To me, if that can be done, we're better for it.
Thank you. And Matt, I'll give you the last word.
I mean, my wish would be to somehow magically fix the wholesale ISP market. I don't know we have a magic wand that can do that in any regulatory policy at this point. I think we've gone too far, and there's no way somebody's going to go put the capital into starting again. But if I had my magic wand, it could turn back the clock. Maybe we can solve that problem. But if we can't solve that problem, the least we can do is start putting open access requirements on any future government funding.
Okay. Well, thank you to all the panelists for this great discussion. Certainly lots of policy ideas to chew on, and I know TCIS will certainly be taking them away in our future work. So thank you, and I hope